Hello, and welcome to the Guardians War Cry podcast channel. I'm here with my buddy Sam Arkansas, and we invited Nancy as well. Nancy's here too. Nancy does a podcast with me that's The Importance of I. And so Sam and I are joined by Nancy today. So welcome all of you.
Happy to be here.
And so am I. Lovely to meet you, Nancy. And I love the fact that we are able to cross over and spread out and information share. So what is your role, Nancy? What's your job? What's your interest in domestic abuse and
Well, I'm in private practice, but I work with people on communication tools so they can improve their own self-esteem. I help them tease out those negative labels that they assign themselves when they're small kids and don't have the ability to reason that that's not true. And just to help them overall function better. There's a lot of anxiety and depression in the folks that I work with.
Okay, and do you work with both? And here's a label for you: victims and perpetrators.
I work with 18 and forever. I've had a 100-year-old lady.
No. Do you? So low self-esteem, obviously, that can lead somebody to abuse. But do you? Where is your focus on the abused or the abuser, or is that not
on the abused?
On the abused.
Well, today we're going to talk about language and labels and how they're used. Sam and I talk a lot, Nancy, about domestic violence and abuse in our countries. And so one of our discussions that Sam and I have had has been about language and about labels. So the mental health communities doesn't seem to respond, or I shouldn't say respond, but doesn't seem to have a real good understanding. They're starting to on domestic violence and abuse. You and I have had a lot of those discussions as well, because it has to do with the experience that the survivors have and people that are in it in educating mental health as well as to what that looks like and what that is. So Sam and I were talking, well, how can we make laws if society doesn't even understand? How can mental health help people who are in these abusive situations if they don't even understand? So what do you think, Nance?
I don't work with groups, so I can't quite put a finger on a global concept. I do work with people who've experienced domestic violence and abuse and work to help them stand up for themselves in an effective way that's non-inflammatory, and to help them empower themselves with communication tools, techniques, and helping them understand that what they have learned to believe about themselves is also a label that they need to peel off, throw away.
So what I'm getting from you is it's more about the I. It's more about the person than the label.
If it's somebody that's in an active situation, I would be very, very careful about how to help them stay safe, what they have for resources, and to practice making I statements in the privacy of their mind or their home so they can get stronger and feel more comfortable about standing up for themselves.
I was going to say that because obviously one of the, it's a main tactic of an abuser is to break somebody, lower their self-esteem and do that brainwashing where they have a separate, a very negative self voice. But even if they have quite a strong self voice, even still, you've got the perpetrator's voice in their heads all the time questioning that. So yeah, it's good to hear that when they're actively. So this is mainly post separation, when they've got that safety and security to be able to start building back up that strength to push back.
Right.
Well, I also think, though, that even if you're still in it, that the tools that Nancy's talking about, which we can go into a little bit, I think, but because speaking about the individual, we still have society that tells us that we're not good enough in different ways. We have religion, we have cultures, we have it's and it's multi-generational that this has come down in the ways, it's like I say all the time, I speak to people all over the world who are telling me the same stories. Their system may not be the same, but the stories are the same. The patterns are the same. And so while Nancy might not work with a group, she wants to work with people who are either in it or not in it. And it's not necessarily post if they're in it, because you can still develop the I and try to get stronger in that in order to leave, because it takes a lot of strength to leave when you have a whole society that's looking at you and saying that, why doesn't she just leave? She could just leave if she wanted to. And you're over here trying to figure out why you can't just leave, because it's not that easy.
Agreed. Very much.
So could you explain, let's say for me, I mean, obviously you two have had lots of conversations. What do you mean when you talk about the I? What's that? Could you explain that to me a little bit more?
Oh, it's one of my favorite things to do. Yeah, we are subliminally programmed. We don't count. Of course, I'm speaking primarily from the United States culture, since that's where I am. But we're not allowed to make I statements as little kids, because that's perceived as egotistical and selfish. So we just don't have a sense of self because of that. So I advocate for people to make I statements. And there's another aspect to that. There is another way to look at selfish, and that is self-ish, meaning of the selfness that we are. We are a self, and we need to be able to acknowledge that primarily to ourselves and display it to the outside world. So the I statement validates the person to themselves, which is the most valuable validation available. We make an I statement, we put a feeling with it. I feel so angry. I had on my handouts, this lady says, beaten down, that's how I feel. And I hadn't noticed that word, but that gives her the opportunity to say, I feel beaten down when you treat me that way, or you talk to me that way. And then she has a sense of being acknowledged on another level. I guess I should say the victim. We make an I statement. We're not going to start the sentence with you. That automatically puts people on the defensive, even if it's a compliment. And we make an I statement, we become more present for someone to relate to.
Okay, that's a really fascinating. Even just thinking about it whilst you're talking, I can see the power just in swapping that language around. And both Kat and I have talked before, and I'm I really do believe in the power of language.
Very much so.
Yeah. And just the slightest change in a sentence or in a word. And the police over here are starting to look at the language that they use around domestic abuse, like simply something, the use of a word just. Oh, it was just whatever. When you talk about the culture in the States, does that means everybody, women and boys? So just as a culture, because I have to say, like preconceptions and things like that, I don't think of the American people as unconfident, So it was really interesting for you to say that actually within the culture, to use an I statement is not something that is looked at positively.
No, it's not.
Well, I think especially for women, because then we become, oh, she's a bitch, or she's full of herself, or who does she think she is? She can talk like that.
Oh, shall we throw out narcissism? Narcissistic.
Well, yeah, and narcissism is that's the whole thing. There's always this language, and that's the other thing that I had talked to Sam about too, is there's all these labels of narcissist and narcissistic personality disorder and codependent and blah blah blah. And I think when you're dealing with emotions, it's hard to figure out what emotion you have if you've been beaten down with the inability to share that emotion, and then have somebody come along and correct you because you're using the word wrong. I don't know. That's just a thought.
Good one.
What it is.
Well, I was just thinking it must actually.
Sorry,
I interrupted you.
I didn't get started, really. Go ahead.
No, because I was just thinking about the use of the word I. It must be particularly difficult. I mean, even just now, just as a woman, certainly as a woman, I understand starting a sentence with I automatically puts you in in what would be to other people, certainly just sometimes men, a very aggressive stance. You're making yourself bigger, you're there in the picture. So I can certainly, for me, I mean, I'm just thinking the idea of using the word I in the relationship that I was in, the whole point was that I didn't exist. That was the point, was to render me completely irrelevant, me as a person, as a functioning robot doing whatever was necessary, yes, but me, Sam, as a person. So the I was annihilated. So I can imagine that was why I asked if it was like cultural men and women, or maybe just women, but certainly from just hearing you talk now, I can imagine that it's actually quite difficult to learn how to use the I again when it's been so battered out of you psychologically, emotionally, and if your autonomy has been battered out of you in multiple levels and in multiple ways. Just thinking about using that word to me is something where I think, it gives me the heebie-jeebies a little bit, because it's a very strong statement with just that one letter.
But I think personally, I think when you use the I, it and I've done work with Nancy on the I's. So, it helps you to ask the question. We ask the question like, "How are you? How do you feel about this? How do you want to handle this? But we don't ask I. How do I feel about this? And I think that's what's so good about Nancy's work, is Nancy's saying you need to check in with yourself. You need to have an identify, or an identification that says I. Because if you don't, then you are lost in relationships. You are lost in society. So if we don't say I,
if we don't speak up, we don't exist.
And I think that if I'm saying to either one of you that I admire what you do, I think that you're amazing is different than you're amazing. Do you see the difference, Sam?
Oh yeah, no,
in how that
absolutely.
feels and comes across.
Absolutely. And it's also, but it's what's interesting is, so initially I took the use of the word "I" in the context of what we were talking about with around domestic abuse and having tools to be able to manage the abuser. So I misunderstood, because to me that was almost like contradictory. It's like the minute that you mention the word "I," that's just going to set them off. So
well, I think that is true. I don't think they're going to like you to have an I. That's the point.
No. So it's just fascinating. I'm just listening. I'm just listening and taking in everything, and thinking back to when I was in that situation and what, like I say, that erasing of your whole persona. So I can imagine that it's a challenge for people to be able to use that I, but also, like you said at the beginning, Nancy, where it's, if they're in that situation, actually just to practice in their own head and get used to the idea. But that must be very liberating when they start remembering that they are a person, because that's something that gets.
I frequently hear the word, I feel empowered, and they start, and I have a handout that supports all this, and so they start with that, and they start using I statements, and it's interesting. They basically wind up doing therapy on themselves, because just about everybody comes in, doesn't feel good. I'm not good enough. And I have to perfect please everyone. Those are the two main ones. And so when they start making I statements, they realize they are good enough. They do have value.
So where did you find and come up with this thinking about the I and noticing how important it was, and come up with this work that you've come up with?
Oh, let's see. I got into a divorce adjustment group a number of years ago, even though mine was a death loss. They took me. And so I got supported on a lot of topics. And I learned that there was such a thing as assertiveness. It was completely out of I didn't know about it. So I started, and that may be where I started using the word I. And I was aware when I first started that I was abrasive, because and what part of my head says, Nancy, you weren't walking when you were born. You had to learn, so just keep at it. And then eventually I got to where I have no idea how many times I'd say I. It's just natural.
I know I went through that when I first started using the I, that I did martial arts. So for me, I did Korean sword. So it almost felt like when I was saying something that I had like a really rough sword, and I was kind of lobbing off arms of people, because I had a brashness about me. I also had an anger about me, about the way that I was being treated, that I felt like I was being treated. And I also believe now in retrospect that I had years and years of not speaking up, of not saying what I thought, of not. And so that was all in that background as well, coming forward. And, there's a lot with body language. Like if I turn my side to somebody, I'm less abrasive than if I turn straight forward and I'm in your face. It's a whole different body language that we use when we're talking, that comes across either in an aggressive way or in an assertive way. And so there's a lot of finesse with that. And, we have to come over ourselves, because the other part to that, I think, is when you say something with an I, people decide you're selfish, which is why I like what Nancy says about the selfless,
and
the ish of being.
Absolutely emphasize that we all in our core have a beautifully purely okay selfness, and that we have to be from that selfness. So we have to be self-ish as being from the selfness. So I tell people, put a hyphen between self and ish to mean of the selfness that we are. And I also teach people that what other people think of you is none of your business.
I agree with that statement. At the same time, when you come from an upbringing that says we need to be, we need to care about others, that's different than having compassion for others.
Well, part of what happens for people is they spend so much energy trying to please others so that they'll be liked. Right. And the hope is that they will gain someone's approval. And right. When that core belief about themselves, that core label, I'm not good enough, is in place, they can't accept somebody else's praise or approval because it doesn't fit. So we will sabotage it or deflect it.
Right, because you can't fill yourself up with somebody else. You have to fill yourself up with you. You have to. That's something that I've realized after, is that. And also, when you really care about somebody, you're going to care what they have to say. But it doesn't mean that you have to change your opinion about what they say. They can have their opinion. They can not like something that you say. They can not like something that you do, and that isn't about you. Because it's and I've said this before, I think on here, I had somebody call me, I've been called all kinds of names, but I had somebody call me a moron. And I'm like, well, I'm not a moron. I define myself. Nobody else defines me. Nobody comes into this space anymore and says, you are not good enough, you are a moron, or you're stupid. I know that I'm not. So in that sense, when Nancy says, it's none of my business what they think, I think it kind of is. I think it kind of is my business, as long as I'm not taking it in. How's that one, Nance?
Woo! Double thumbs up. The most important relationship in the entire universe is the one we have with ourselves. And if we have a low opinion, we're going to act that out. We're going to attract more of the same attitudes and behaviors, because it's kind of the law of attraction. What we put out tends to come back to us. And some days I'm really not happy with that idea. Even being pretty well adjusted. Yeah.
I remember driving down the street one time, and this man stepped out onto the street, and there was a sign up, and it's a big guy, and he actually got arrested for domestic violence and abuse. He was in the sheriff's department. And as soon as I didn't think I had to stop, but there was a new sign, and apparently I had to stop. One of my kids said it to me. And so I stopped, and he was stepping out, and his whole chest puffed up, angry. And I rolled down my window and I said, I'm sorry, I didn't realize I had to stop. And then his chest went down when I took that stance of apologizing for scaring him. At the same time, it helped me to see how I'm just driving down the street, I make a mistake, and this man's whole bravado is up, and he's letting me know I have crossed the line without saying a word. And I think you see that all the time in you can go in the grocery store, and somebody will come in front of you, and I'm going to say a man because it's what I've noticed, but a man will, and women have done it too, but a man will come in front of me and just not even say a word like excuse me or anything. He just has the idea that he should be able to walk in front of me, and it's not a big deal. Where you'll watch women, they'll be like, oh, excuse me, oh, I'm sorry, and all these things. And it's just a difference we had a commercial here that was really cool that talked about it in like a guy getting coffee for all the guys and women in the conference room. He opens up the door and he says, "Hey, I'm getting coffee. What do you guys want?" And they tell him, where a woman opens the door, she's like, "I'm sorry, I'm bothering you. I'm getting some coffee. What would you guys like?" Totally different approach. I don't know if it's the same over there in the UK for that kind of stuff. Just slight differences in, like if there's an empty chair next to a man, you might go over and there might not be any other way or any place other to sit, and you'll say, "Excuse me, can I take that chair?" And because you don't want to make them upset. It's just culturally taught differently, and I don't really understand some of it. But
it shows up a lot in wages. Men make way more money doing the same job that a woman does.
yeah, that's one way it shows up for sure.
Oh yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
What do you think, Sam?
It does. It doesn't make me laugh, but I kind of think sometimes, like, how, if you, I don't know how long now, how many years, decades, it's like, oh, how do we fix the gender pay gap? Well, it's dead simple. Bring both wages up together, or bring one down, just equalize them. That's all you have to do. Literally, at the end, you hire somebody, you hire them for the job that they're doing, irrelevant of their sex or anything else. It's, are they capable of doing the job? Are they doing the same job as somebody else? Are they as qualified? There's a set pay for that, and that's it. End of. So it seems pretty simple, right? I know that somebody would, who ran a company or whatever, would say, "Oh, well, there's this, there's that, there's a future investment." That's gaslighting. That's just bull to cover up the fact that it's just a choice that can be made, and people aren't making it. And then that leaves us with the question of, well, why aren't they doing it? It's the why in that for me. So we've got I, now we've got why. It's like with it.
Oh, and Nancy's got some good one about that why thing.
But it's like, it's I've been feeling this a lot lately. We do have a lot of information. We have laws. We have all of these things. And there's 16 days of activism. And it's like, but nobody's getting prosecuted. Nobody is holding abusers to account on any level, whether it's of children, women, men, or whatever. But certainly not in the domestic abuse arena. So you get to the point where the only question you can ask is, well, why? If I know, how come people who this is their whole work and life and experience, and it's their job to know, why aren't they doing something?
But I think Nancy doesn't know that the UK, Nancy, has a law about coercive control. And that's what Sam's talking about.
Sorry, yes. So
there is a law about language, basically.
Yeah, so we've had, so in the UK, we've changed it. It's domestic abuse, to incorporate all of the different kinds of abuse, not just the purely directly physical violence.
Wonderful.
I would have preferred for all of them to be called violences, because abuse, again, with that word, almost slightly downgrades the impact.
As if it's not as serious.
It's not as serious as violence. So there's but the reasoning behind it, I think, is very sensible. But we got the coercive control was added into our Domestic Abuse Act. We got the new Domestic Abuse Act in 2015. And still to this day, only 6% of cases even make it to charge, let alone prosecution or sentencing. And if they manage to get to that stage, very often it's so coercive control has got, it's only a 5-year maximum sentence anyway. But very often it's attached to physical violence and assault. The occasional ones that are sort of getting through, it's a suspended sentence. I mean, violence against women and girls, our rape cases have gone down from 1.6% down to 1.3%. These crimes are actually being decriminalised in this country. So whilst others look to us and say, oh, you've got all of these acts and these laws, the implementation of them is not happening at all. So you ask, but so it isn't through lack of knowledge. It's not through lack of laws. It's not through lack of activism or awareness. We have to ask, why is this so? Why is violence against women and girls being decriminalised, basically?
But I think seriously, I mean, the reason we talk and the reason we have these conversations is not necessarily about why, but how come. Because Nancy has a real thing about the word why, because it drives circles, and it does. And I think, I was talking to somebody in South Africa, and she believes that the 16 days of activism is actually just lip service. Because while it's getting information out there, it's still not driving the things against women to come down. And I think as women talking about it and having conversation and calling it out in a way that is saying, how come this isn't working? What can we do better? When we have a society that says, well, why doesn't she leave? And doesn't ask the question, why does he abuse? And I know I'm using genders there because that's what it's been for years. And so
primarily,
if I'm going to use them correctly, I might say, why don't they leave? And why don't we understand why abusers abuse? But in reality, I think we have to answer the questions of how come. How come it's okay for an abuser to decide that they're going to take somebody down and they don't really care what that looks like at home? They do care what it looks like in society.
Oh yeah.
They're not going to admit that they did that. She remembers wrong or he remembers wrong. I would never say that. I'm not that kind of person.
I think it goes back to generations of the male idea of superiority. And women almost have to have a big, strong man, back in the caveman days to do the hunting while we took care of the kids and gathered nuts and berries. It's the idea that we're different, that we're better than and less than, that becomes the problem. And as far as the pay scales not changing very much, I sense that a lot of the higher ups in these agencies and companies are male, and they don't particularly want to change those pay scales.
So when I ask the question why, that's the only conclusion that you can come to. So I'm asking, say that this is our language differences, so my why is a how come, because it's like there is only one conclusion, which is it's a choice. It's an active choice.
But I think the importance of understanding the why, Sam, is why doesn't this happen this way? It's always, it kind of reminds me of the 4-year-olds and the 5-year-olds. You ask, they ask a question, why is the sky blue? I don't know, honey, it's just blue. You come up with, and some other way to say it, and it's why. It's always why. And so I think that's what Nancy's talking about in that question, why always drives, even in language. Just think about it and try an experiment this week. And instead of asking why, ask how come or what, or
so what's the reason
in place of the why, and see what kind of response you get that's different.
Bingo, Kat.
I'm going to be, I've
my
got a lot of homework to do this weekend. I've got I's to be using. I've got what's and wherefores and everything. I was just going back to the I, actually. I wrote something down because I can see where the empowerment comes from, because it's also about reconnecting. If you say the word I think, for instance, it's actually about you reconnecting with what do you think, remembering that you are actually allowed to think those things. What do I want? What do I need? What do I think? Again, so that reconnecting with that. So just asking yourself, I think, well, what do I think?
Cat, as they said in My Fair Lady, I think she's got it.
That was a rather fabulous British accent, but no, I can absolutely see that how empowering that would be, especially post abuse relationship, because again, that it's reconnecting with those thought patterns, isn't it, that have been interrupted by the abuse. I think that's fantastic.
You still have to deal with, like, thinking about how to express that in a way that's honorable to yourself. And I also want to make a clarification too that I think is important is I always ask the question, and I think I've asked it on both of you, but what is your favorite animal, your favorite wild animal? And no matter what anybody says, I always answer with, and I'll just use a bear. If we don't look at a bear and say, well, you're a lousy representation of a bear. We look at a bear and we say, it's beautiful in its strength and its size and its love of its cubs. If we're talking about a mother bear, we don't call it out of not being a bear. And I think we do that all the time to ourselves as humans. We
agree.
We are simply human and purely human. It's innate. We don't have to defend the fact that we're human. And
we shouldn't have to.
Right. And I think that, yes, I can improve on something that I personally want to improve on, but that doesn't make me less of a human if I'm not perfect, because I think that perfection is something that is driven also in an abusive relationship. Their perfection thought of you is...
Perfection is such a trap, and it comes from who knows how many generations back. But in order to be perfect, we have to know what the pieces of proof are that we're perfect. And my opinion of perfection would be different than yours, Kat, yours, Sam. So we can't be perfect. It's a standard that's totally impossible.
And I think with...
And in abuse...
Sorry, Kat.
I was just going to say, and in abusive relationships, that's always changed anyway. Because once you get used to being a certain way, then they continue to drive something different depending on what reaction they're wanting for whatever reason they're wanting.
when it's known that one of the patterns is when you first meet them, as far as they put across to you, you are their perfect. Everything about you is their perfect. And they also hoover up all the information so that they become your perfect in that at the very beginning. And then that's when the goalposts start being moved and moved and moved and moved. And suddenly you are, or insidiously, and as you go along, you couldn't be further from perfect, but where you're actually still the same person in theory when you met, other than the changes that have been wrought in you by their abuse towards you, you know.
Each one trying to match my feeling of perfect, and I'm upset because he didn't meet it, and vice versa. We operate out of that, our own idea of perfection is, and since it can't be done, that just adds to the angst for both people. So when I work with my clients, I advocate them to realize, I have an affirmation they all get. I now realize I am purely okay, and I don't have to prove it or earn it.
I've got one. I don't know whether you like it or not. I am imperfectly perfect. I am perfect.
Again,
I am imperfectly perfect. So I'm perfect in my imperfections. Every scar, every wrinkle, every whatever, I'm.
Well, the nice thing about the nice thing about okay, there's no judgment in it. It's okay to have a cup of coffee. It's okay to go to a movie. It's okay to go to dinner. It's okay.
But also, okay is like you're just okay. It's like, I'm okay. Whereas it's like, no, you're actually, I think you're fabulous, because that's my thing. I think Kat is fabulous. I think she's beautiful. I think all of those things, because that's what she is to me. So she is those things,
That's because she knows in her core she's okay. She gets to be who she is. No ifs, ands, or buts. She doesn't have to prove it or earn it. She just gets to be Kat because she's coming from that.
It's still hard some days, because some days something happens and you have to really check in and make sure that.
Then we kind of bump up about the difference in react and response. It's hard not to respond to things, particularly if the sentence starts with you, which is one of the things that I try and talk people out of doing.
So I'm really interested, Nancy, in whether you work with abusers or not. And obviously, and Kat and I have said this before, we because the majority, it is a gendered crime. On the one hand, it's not gendered on the other, but we as women talk, because the majority of victims are women. That's how we use those pronouns. But I'd be really interested to know, have you worked with abusers at all, and how do they present, and does it have any effect on them, even if they do have access help? I mean, my understanding is that abusers just don't want to.
Right, that's right. I'm sure. I've only had one incident where there was an abuser involved in the sessions. As I remember, it made things a little tense. Didn't feel free to interact with the victim of that pair. Eventually, the abuser took a class in anger management, and it did make a difference in the way the victim was treated. Still, the fact that the couple came as a couple, and when it was one of the victim's idea to get help, still was, it just didn't help the therapy process.
Well, because quite often it's one of the things that's known in our coercive and controlling laws. One of the tactics is to either deny medical treatment or help or therapy, or go to the doctors themselves, or always come with the victim, usually, to the appointments, in order to shut down that freedom and to silence them. So it's interesting that it feels like that's what the intention was of the abuser in the first place. Yet they ended up on an anger management course. Was that their choice?
That's the way it worked.
Okay. So do you think in general that abusers can be helped? Because there's two very different thought processes on this, that they know exactly what they're doing and it is actually a choice, and that they do it because they want to and they can. But obviously, it's like everything, I suppose, on the spectrum, but sort of generally it's accepted, I think, that there is really there's no point in trying to help an abuser because they just don't want to. What's your...
In fact, they don't come see me is kind of evidence of that. If there were someone like that would come in for some help, I would get an extensive family history. Chances are the client witnessed domestic violence and thinks that's normal, where it's supposed to be, or this person get the idea they had to control things. What's their opinion of themselves? So they need to feel superior, and instead of to cover up, I'm not good enough or something. I would go to those motives and definitely go into where those ideas came from and help them to see that they don't need to carry those labels. And one of the things that is hard for people is to get in touch with anger. We're kind of taught anger is we're not supposed to be angry. Anger is natural. And anger happens when we've been disrespected. It's what we do with anger that gets us in trouble.
So we'll do anger on another day. I think I just want to go back to the label for a second. In the use of labels that are... So my understanding of labels in the mental health is the labels that are used for codependency, for narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, and the myriad of all the other labels that fall underneath mental health, is for diagnostic treatment of those people. It is not to be used for identifying that person as you are a codependent or you are a narcissist. To me, it feels like another way of...
And it's important, again, to talk about the behavior, not the person.
Right.
And
so narcissistic behavior is different, and codependency behavior is different than
I think that
calling somebody that.
People take on a label because it makes them feel like it's an identity, at least, whether it's healthy or not, at least it's an identity. And
okay, so that goes back to the whole I thing.
Mm-hmm. Takes us right back there.
I see how that would be different, and I see how that's important, I think, for people to understand that I am more than just...
Yeah, that's one time that people use I. I'm disabled. I'm codependent. So it's teaching them that there's other ways to look at themselves.
Well, I know that when I first left, I did a lot of somebody told me how I was. You are this way. You do this. You do that. And I came back with, I define me. People are not going to come inside this space here and tell me who I am. I've had enough of that. In that, I'm imperfectly perfect, just like Sam says. I have no problems with that. If I say something and it's off cuff and I've hurt somebody's feelings, I'm going to own it. At the same time, I'm not going to sit here and beat myself up because I wasn't perfect enough for somebody. It's going to be identified inside.
That was a major shift in how you saw yourself. And I'm pretty sure it took quite a while and a lot of internal fortitude and determination. For someone like that, I very seriously hope to plant the idea that change is possible. And these are some of the ways we can go about making those changes. So that's where I comes in. I like to start with I because there's a person in front of me. And I want them to realize that there's a person in front of me and I see that person.
Yeah, and it's not just a client.
No,
not
it's
just
not.
a money
No.
thing. That's important, I think.
Clients are on paper. I have people.
I have to say, it is such a powerful, the more I've thought about it through this whole hour or so of our podcast, I keep coming back to the fact that it's just one single letter in our alphabet, and the multiple leveled power that has. If you ever needed anything to show the power of language and the power of a label and the power of how we use a word, and this is just one letter, this is it. You know, it's once you do start thinking about it, it is really quite incredible, you know.
But I had to learn this stuff, all the things that I give people in the handouts, and I have one specifically that I created. So everything that's on those 2 pages came from my lessons and what I learned. So I'm happy to let people know I had to learn this stuff. Also to show them that it's doable to learn.
Well,
we'll cover that in the next one.
Fantastic. So we'll have all of these eyes walking around, people going, I. I.
I listened to the podcast.
Yes.
I found out from I about how important I was from Nancy.
Yeah. I think that's fantastic.
I am what I am.
I am what I am.
And we're all learning the time. I think that my personal belief is, you know, the day we all think that we've all learned anything there is to learn is the day we may as well give up.
Well, I find that something will come along and get my attention anyway. So,
well, you know, and I do want to, you know, say that we're going to have more conversations on the podcast about I and about language and about labels. I'd also like to say that thank you to both of you for coming today, and we're going to finish up this podcast. And one of these times we're going to talk about anger. I think that's a really good.
I agree.
Subject, and I is not gendered.
No. So,
and you know, if we can
see you next
time. We'll see you in a few minutes on the other side.
Absolutely.
Next time.
Lovely to see you. Thank you, Nancy.
Love you. Bye, Nance.
Bye-bye. Nice to meet you, Sam.
Hello. Thank you for watching our channel today. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell for any new content, and find us on Patreon and your favorite podcasts. We hope we're one of them. Bye-bye.